You really thought Mom and Dad would ever trust you with the house? Everyone here knows they've always loved me more. My brother's voice rang out sharp and cocky, over the clatter of pint glasses and half-slurred laughter in the dim back corner of Murphy's bar. And the sting of his words drew out a few awkward chuckles from the cousins, neighbors, and even one of my old high school buddies who just shifted uncomfortably, but didn't look up from his beer. Because when someone serves humiliation straight to your face in public, the whole room feels that strange mixture of relief that it isn't them and shame that they're complicit in silence. And I just sat there for a second, staring at the foam in my glass, willing myself not to let the anger spill too fast. Because nothing in my life had prepared me for the way betrayal sounds when it's not whispered behind your back, but broadcast in a crowded bar on a Saturday night. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 36 years old, born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, a city people either drive through or leave, but never brag about staying in. Though I've stuck around out of both duty and, I guess, some twisted loyalty that's always been my flaw. The same loyalty that kept me bailing out my brother Ryan when he tanked his credit. The same loyalty that had me covering hospital bills when Dad had his second heart scare, and the same loyalty that made me think maybe, just maybe, my sacrifices would eventually mean something when Mom and Dad had to decide who'd carry the family home into the future. And here I was, hearing Ryan crow like he'd already won some invisible prize, when in truth there was a secret detail tucked away in a drawer he hadn't looked in. A detail I discovered almost by accident, one that would change the game entirely when the time was right, but I kept that tucked in my chest, like a cold blade I'd only draw when I could cut the deepest. There's a truth men in their 30s learn the hard way. Family doesn't always stab you when you're down. Sometimes they push you down just to see if you'll bleed slower than they expect. Another truth is simpler. In America, love often gets measured in dollar signs and square footage, not in quiet nights spent fixing broken faucets or hauling groceries up icy steps. And Ryan had always been the kind of guy who thought charm was currency enough, the golden child who never learned how to sweat honestly. The bar smelled of fried onion rings and spilled whiskey, and I caught my reflection in the streaked mirror behind the bottles. Saw a face a little more tired than last year, jaw tighter, hairline receding at the edges but not gone yet, and I thought about how Ryan's grin looked like the same one he wore when we were kids playing backyard baseball. The grin that meant he was about to cheat the rules and dare you to call him out. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply, not then, but the silence was its own statement, and I heard someone mutter, "Damn, Dan's not saying a word," like my refusal to rise to the bait was weakness. Though I knew better, sometimes silence is the only hammer left when words would only bounce back as nails. The thing about betrayal is it doesn't just gut you. It rearranges your insides until trust feels like a foreign accent you can't mimic anymore, and that realization hit me harder than the beer in my veins. Ryan raised his glass, smirking, and toasted to the rightful heir. And while the room half-heartedly clinked glasses, I stared down at the small chipped ceramic keychain that hung from my truck keys on the bar, the one shaped like a baseball glove with a little leather lace threading through it, a gift Dad gave me at 12 after my first game where I pitched 3 strikeouts in a row. And suddenly, that stupid little trinket felt like the only anchor in a storm because I knew right then it wasn't just about the house or the will. It was about every quiet, unseen act of loyalty that was about to be erased in favor of Ryan's louder lies. A guy at the end of the bar whispered something about the Buckeyes game, a lifeline of distraction, and I let the chatter wash over me as my mind raced to darker corners. Because here's the philosophy no one tells you until it's too late. Loyalty without boundaries isn't noble. It's a leash you fasten around your own neck and then hand to someone else. And I had done that my whole life. My hand tightened around the keychain until the edges dug into my palm, and I thought of all the years working double shifts at the auto plant, the smell of coolant and burnt rubber baked into my clothes, every paycheck siphoned into keeping the family afloat while Ryan coasted from one half-baked business scheme to another, never paying back, never apologizing, just moving on like debts were erased by time itself. I caught the way the bartender, an older guy named Phil with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, looked at me, half pity, half don't start a fight in my bar, and I nodded slightly to let him know I wasn't about to turn this into a scene. Not yet. Outside, through the grimy window, I could see the glow of my Ford's headlights reflected off the rain-slick asphalt. The truck that had hauled more furniture, groceries, and busted appliances for this family than anyone ever remembered, And suddenly the absurdity of it all hit me. My brother mocking me, my parents blind in their favoritism, everyone pretending like effort had no currency, like the ledger of sacrifice wasn't worth even glancing at. Still, I stayed quiet, because men like me learn early that speaking too soon is how you waste the only bullet you've got, and I wasn't about to shoot until I could hit the heart. Ryan's laugh cut across the room again as he leaned against the bar and told another story about how Danny boy here couldn't even hold a marriage together, and I saw a couple of heads shake in sympathy, but no one corrected him. No one reminded him that my marriage fell apart because I was working myself to the bone while she drifted into someone else's arms. That was another scar I carried silently. Another reason I knew better than to believe love was unconditional. The jukebox kicked in with Springsteen's Glory Days, and I almost laughed at the irony because Ryan had never had any glory days to lose. His whole life was one long con where he convinced people he was destined for greatness while others paid his way. I finished the rest of my beer in one long pull, the bitterness clinging to the back of my throat, and dropped a crumpled 10 on the bar as I stood, the weight of Ryan's smirk pressing into my back. And though I didn't turn around, I knew the look he was giving me, the one that said he thought he'd already won. But the truth was, I'd already seen the crack in his armor weeks ago when I stumbled on that envelope hidden behind Dad's old tax folders, the one detail that would one day burn his whole game to ash. But for now, I let him think the night was his, because revenge isn't about the heat of the moment. It's about the patience to let the fire build. And as I pushed through the heavy door into the cold drizzle outside, the sound of Ryan's laughter echoing behind me, I knew that the storm he thought he'd summoned was only just beginning to gather above him, though he had no idea that the thunder would strike from a place he'd never thought to look. And as the rain tapped against my jacket and the parking lot lights buzzed with that faint, electrical hum, I slid into the driver's seat of my Ford and just sat there with the engine off, letting the smell of wet upholstery and the faint lingering trace of black coffee from the travel mug in the Q folder settle me. Because sometimes you need silence before you can plan the kind of moves that carve people open without ever raising your voice. The dashboard clock read 12:43 a.m., and I thought about how in just a few hours I'd be back at the plant, face lit by the white glare of machinery, supervisors barking quotas, the rhythm of the line demanding more energy than a human should reasonably give. And yet I'd do it, same as always, because consistency was all I had to offer the world. And somehow that consistency had been painted as weakness, while Ryan's recklessness was crowned charm. The absurdity of it gnawed at me as I turned the key and listened to the engine rumble alive, headlights cutting through the drizzle, casting thin shadows of the half-empty beer bottles scattered by the bar's back door. My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel, and I thought about something Dad once said after a particularly bad Little League loss when I was 13. The world doesn't care how hard you try, Dan, only how well you hide the bruises. And maybe that was the only lesson he really passed to me, though Ryan must have been given a different sermon because he learned to flaunt his wounds until someone else carried him. Driving home, I passed the old high school football field where the goalposts leaned slightly and the bleachers were rusted from decades of Midwest rain, and a memory flickered me and Ryan sneaking beers under those stands at 17. Me worrying about not getting caught while he laughed, swore he'd always have my back. And it hit me how betrayal tastes worse when it's brewed over years of trust. The wipers squeaked in uneven arcs, and for some reason, my eyes landed on the baseball glove keychain swinging against the ignition, that chipped ceramic thing that seemed laughably small, but carried more weight in my chest than all the paperwork Ryan thought he'd won. And I realized right then that symbols matter not because they're expensive, but because they hold the echoes of promises you didn't think would be broken. Pulling into my driveway, the porch light flickered, casting shadows across the peeling paint of the front steps. A house far smaller than the Mercer place, but one I'd paid for brick by brick with overtime, not with handouts, and as I killed the engine and listened to it tick into myself like a madman. Loyalty isn't noble if it costs you your spine. Words that felt sharp enough to ETCH themselves into the steering wheel. And in that moment I knew I couldn't just let this slide like I had with so many of Ryan's stunts. Inside, the house smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old wood, a smell that grounded me more than anything. And I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the baseball glove clinking against the edge, a sound so small yet final it was like a gavel. And I realized I was entering a new trial me against him, quiet resilience against loud entitlement. I flicked on the TV for background noise, some late-night sports recap playing highlights of the Bengals game. The kind of meaningless chatter that usually calmed me, but my mind was miles away, replaying every smirk, every dig Ryan had thrown at me in that bar, and the laughter that followed like salt on raw skin. I grabbed a notebook from the counter, the kind I usually used for jotting down repair schedules, and I started writing not plans exactly, more like fragments of thought, words like trust equals currency and patience bleeds slower and technicalities are the knives no one sees, because sometimes writing is the only way to shape chaos into something that looks like intention. My hand shook a little from the adrenaline that still hadn't drained, and I thought about all the years I'd carried this family, like Atlas bent under a sky no one else wanted to touch, and how Ryan had managed to turn that weight into his excuse for floating free, the golden sun untouched by gravity. Around 2 a.m., I microwaved some leftover chili, the beans and spice hitting my stomach like a brick but warming me enough to think straighter, and I caught myself laughing softly at the absurdity of sitting alone in my kitchen, chili in one hand, pen in the other, plotting the dismantling of my own brother. But the laughter faded quick because there's nothing funny about realizing your blood has marked you as expendable. That's when I remembered the envelope. Tucked away in my closet safe beneath a stack of old service manuals, its contents too powerful to reveal yet but glowing in my mind like a fuse that would one day ignite, and I forced myself not to pull it out, not yet, because timing was everything, and revenge without patience is just another tantrum. By 3, sleep wouldn't come, so I laced up my sneakers and went for a run through the slick streets, the air sharp with the smell of rain-soaked asphalt, my breath clouding under the street lamps. Each footfall, a drumbeat of anger, burning into focus. I passed shuttered diners, their neon signs buzzing faintly, and thought about how many times I'd sat in those booths with coworkers, greasy eggs and black coffee fueling us through the exhaustion, and how none of that grind ever earned me applause from the family. While Ryan showing up with a new story about big deals got him praise like he was some Wall Street prodigy instead of a man who couldn't keep a bank account open. My lungs burned. Legs aching, but I pushed harder, because pain was the only thing that felt clean right then. The only reminder that I was still in control of my own body, if nothing else. Back home, sweat cooling on my skin, I showered in silence, water pounding against sore muscles, and I told myself out loud, "He doesn't get to erase me." Words that echoed against the tile like a vow, and as I toweled off and saw my reflection in the fogged mirror, eyes bloodshot but steady, I realized that while Ryan thought he'd humiliated me, he'd really just signed his own name on a debt he didn't know he owed, and debts always get collected one way or another, even if the collector has to bleed a little to get there. The clock read 5:12 a.m. when I finally collapsed onto the couch instead of the bed, unable to stop thinking about how the cousins had laughed, how Mom would probably dismiss it as just Ryan being Ryan, how Dad would stay silent like always, and how the weight of all of that was now a fire in my chest that no amount of sleep could smother. And as my eyelids grew heavy, the only clear thought left in me was that the house wasn't the prize anymore, it was the battlefield, and Ryan had no idea how carefully I was already mapping every inch of it. Waiting to be fought over with words sharper than knives, and the first cut came sooner than I expected, because by the time the sun crawled weakly across the blinds and lit up the living room in dull gold, my phone was already buzzing with a group text from Mom, a cheerful little line about family brunch at 11, don't be late, as if last night hadn't been a public execution of my dignity, as if humiliation could be rinsed off with orange juice and pancakes. I stared at the screen for a long moment, thumb hovering over the keyboard, torn between ignoring it and showing up. But deep down, I knew absence would only be used against me, painted as proof that I was the bitter one, the unreliable son, so I typed, "I'll be there," and tossed the phone onto the coffee table, the baseball glove keychain catching the morning light where it rested in the ceramic bowl, that chipped little relic reminding me that symbols survive where memories fade. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the smell filling the kitchen, rich and bitter, a smell that anchored me more than any embrace from my family ever had, and as I sat there sipping from the mug, I thought about how men in my shoes often confuse endurance with respect, when the truth is, no one respects the mule that carries everyone else, they just get used to the load disappearing when it finally collapses. Driving to Mom's place later, the roads were alive with church traffic, minivans packed with families in their Sunday best, and I couldn't help thinking how all those people probably believed in forgiveness. While I was clutching a secret in my chest, like scripture written in fire, the kind that doesn't save souls but scorches them. Pulling into the Mercer driveway, I saw Ryan's car already parked crooked by the curb, shiny from a fresh wash he probably didn't pay for. And I felt that old irritation crawl under my skin, the way he always had to arrive first, stake the ground like he owned it. Inside, the house smelled like bacon and cinnamon rolls, and for a moment, nostalgia almost soft me. The creak of the floorboards, the worn rug by the door, the framed photos of us as kids lining the hallway. But then Mom swept in with her apron and her quick smile, kissing my cheek, and all I could see was how blind her eyes were to the way her golden boy sharpened his claws on me. Ryan was already at the table, laughing too loud at something Dad had muttered, and when I walked in, he gave me that smug half-salute like we were old pals instead of brothers divided by a lifetime of imbalance. "Morning, champ," he said, mouth full of eggs, and I clenched my jaw so tight it hurt, because I knew what he was doing painting me as the runner-up before the contest had even begun. We sat, plates clattering, conversation forced, Dad mumbling about the Bengals' defense, Mom asking me about work in that perfunctory tone that said she wasn't listening, and Ryan steering the whole thing back to himself, talking about some new business opportunity he was chasing, which I knew was code for another scheme that would collapse before it began. Every time he spoke, Mom's eyes lit up like Christmas, and every time I did, the room seemed to dull, and I thought about how silence wasn't just a weapon I used, it was a condition they imposed on me too. Halfway through brunch, Ryan raised his glass of orange juice and made a little speech, casual but pointed, about how the future's looking pretty secure for us, huh, Mom? And she smiled knowingly, and that was the moment I realized they'd already had conversations without me, decisions made in rooms I wasn't invited into, and the humiliation from the bar replayed itself in daylight. Sharper this time because here it was family, not bystanders. I wanted to slam my fork down, demand answers, but instead I watched the baseball glove keychain swing against my thigh where my keys sat in my pocket, and I thought of Dad giving it to me, and how in that moment years ago he'd looked at me like I was the one carrying the family name with dignity, and I knew I couldn't explode here. Not yet. There's a kind of rage that doesn't scream, it marinates, thickens, turns into something colder than hate, and that's what was hardening in me as I cleared my plate and listened to Ryan ramble about renovations he'd make to the place once it was his responsibility, as if ownership was already carved in stone. After brunch, Mom pulled me aside by the sink while she rinsed dishes, water splashing over her hands, and she said in that soft, patronizing tone, "Danny, you know how your brother is, but he's family, and at the end of the day, we all need to stick together." And I wanted to laugh in her face because sticking together had always meant me sticking around to clean up his messes. But instead I just nodded, swallowing down the bitterness like acid, because I understood now more than ever that revenge requires camouflage, and my silence would be my disguise until the trap was ready. Driving home, the radio played an old Springsteen track again, The River this time, and the lyrics about dreams gone dry cut deep. Not because they mirrored me exactly, but because they reminded me that every man eventually realizes no one's coming to rescue him from the weight of expectation. And you either drown or you learn how to turn that river into a current that drags your enemies under first. Back at my place, I opened the safe, pulled out the envelope, and stared at the papers inside. Documents that carried the kind of authority no charm or manipulation could override. And I whispered to myself, technicalities don't care about golden boys. Words that steadied me because here was proof, tangible and real, that Ryan's empire was built on air and one day I'd pull the ground out from under him. I put the envelope back, locked the safe, and sat on the couch with another mug of coffee, steam rising like the calm before battle, and I thought about how some wars aren't fought in trenches or boardrooms, but in dining rooms and courthouses, in whispered conversations and smirks across barrooms, and the thought didn't scare me, it electrified me. Night fell, the street outside quiet except for the occasional whoosh of a passing car. And I sat there in the dim glow of the TV without really watching, my mind replaying every humiliation, every overlooked sacrifice, and every smug grin Ryan had thrown my way. And the more I replayed them, the more I felt the fire sharpen into something surgical, a blade honed on silence. At some point I dozed off, the empty mug still in my hand, and in my dreams I was back on the high school baseball field, the glove keychain in my hand instead of a ball, and Ryan standing at the plate smirking, daring me to throw, and I wound up, arm burning, ready to release, but just as I let go, the dream shattered into the buzz of my alarm clock, its cheap plastic body rattling on the nightstand like it was mocking me, and I slammed it off with a groggy hand, the residue of that imagined throw still lingering in my muscles as if I'd actually hurled something across the field. Monday mornings never gave mercy, and this one felt heavier than most. The gray sky pressing low over Dayton as I dragged myself into the plant, steel-toed boots clunking across the concrete, fluorescent lights humming like a swarm of flies overhead. The foreman barked orders, machines roared, sparks flew in showers, and I fell into rhythm, the repetition numbing enough to keep my mind from boiling over, though Ryan's voice still echoed in the back of my skull like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Every clang of metal was a reminder of what I built with sweat and hours, and how invisible that building always was to the people who should have valued it most. On break, I sat outside on the concrete steps with a thermos of coffee, steam curling into the cold morning. Coworkers clustered around in hoodies and ball caps, talking about the Buckeyes game or their kids' weekend soccer matches, and I listened quietly, not because I didn't have stories, but because lately my words felt wasted. One guy, Frank, asked if I was all right, said I looked like I hadn't slept, and I just shrugged, muttered something about family crap, and he gave me that knowing nod, the kind men give when they've got their own private wars, but don't ask details. That nod meant more than all of Ryan's fake toasts combined, because it was honest recognition without judgment. Lunch was a sandwich I barely tasted. My stomach nodded with a sense of urgency I couldn't shake, because revenge, no matter how patient, has a heartbeat of its own, and mine was thundering louder by the day. After the shift, I drove to Dad's old storage unit, the one he'd rented years ago and then forgotten about, and with the spare key I'd found tucked into a toolbox after his last hospital stay, I swung open the metal door to reveal stacks of boxes, old tools, yellowed newspapers, relics of a life that had once been fuller. Dust coated everything, the smell of mildew strong, but what caught my eye was a cedar chest shoved into the corner, one I recognized from childhood, the chest Mom used to store holiday decorations before she claimed it had been lost. I pried it open and inside found not ornaments but files, folders of receipts, insurance forms, old contracts, and I knew instantly that this was the kind of paper trail men like Ryan never thought about. The boring but deadly kind of evidence that could prove who had really been holding things together all these years. As I sifted through them, my hands trembling slightly, I came across a crumpled letter from the bank, addressed to my father but referencing a loan Ryan had taken out in Dad's name years back, a loan I'd unknowingly paid off when I covered medical expenses one summer. My stomach twisted at the realization that my brother's schemes had gone deeper than I thought, that he'd been bleeding us dry in ways I never even saw, and suddenly the anger felt less like fire and more like ice, a cold clarity that made my breath slow. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or favoritism, this was theft wearing the mask of family, and I knew then that when I eventually revealed the truth, the damage would be permanent. I locked the chest, slid it back into place, and stepped out into the fading light of evening, the sky streaked pink and orange, a beauty that mocked the ugliness of what I was carrying, and as I shut the unit door, I whispered to myself, "Details bury kings," because Ryan had built his whole crown on ignoring them. Driving home, the radio blasted commercials for car dealerships and fast food chains, noise that barely registered, my mind too occupied with images of Ryan strutting around the Mercer house like he already owned it, Mom smiling as if nothing was wrong, Dad silent in his recliner, and me, the shadow no one acknowledged until something broke. I pulled into my driveway and saw the porch light flicker again, same as it had the night before, and instead of irritation, it struck me as symbolic, the kind of detail Ryan would never notice, but one I could turn into a story if I ever needed to prove who actually maintained the bones of this family. Inside, I reheated leftover chili again, the taste blander this time. Not because the recipe had changed, but because bitterness makes everything dull, and as I ate, I scribbled more notes in my battered notebook. Leverage equals hidden in plain sight. Trust equals rope. Pull too hard and it snaps. He doesn't know the safe. Phrases that steadied me like mile markers on a dark road. Around 9, the phone rang, Ryan's number flashing across the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out, but then I answered, voice flat, and his laughter spilled through the line like oil, slick, thick and greasy. "Hey, little brother, just wanted to make sure you weren't too sore about Saturday," he said, his tone fake sweet, and I could picture his grin even without seeing it. I kept my reply measured, "I'm fine," because giving him silence unnerved him more than anger, and sure enough he filled the space quickly, bragging about how Mom and Dad were finally recognizing where the real potential is, hinting about some papers being drawn up, dangling his triumph like bait. My chest tightened, but I forced a small chuckle, played along, because men like Ryan thrived on your reaction, and withholding it was like starving a parasite. We hung up after a few minutes of his self-congratulation, and I sat there in the quiet, the baseball glove keychain cold in my hand, and thought about how symbols once chosen can become weapons sharper than any blade. Before bed, I went for another run, legs pounding against the pavement, lungs burning, sweat stinging my eyes, and I repeated under my breath like a mantra, "He doesn't know. He doesn't know," until the rhythm of it felt like armor. When I finally collapsed back onto the couch, chest heaving, I stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me and realized the strangest thing. I wasn't afraid of losing the house anymore. What I feared was letting Ryan win unchallenged, letting him paint history, so I vanished from it, and I swore to myself in that moment that when the time came, I wouldn't just defend what was mine, I would make sure everyone saw who he really was, even if it meant burning every bridge in the process, because the thought of silence being my legacy was unbearable. And as I lay there staring at the spinning blades of the fan, I imagined a future where Ryan's lies had become the family truth, where every story about sacrifice or loyalty had my name edited out, and that vision jolted me upright with such force it was like waking from a nightmare. The next morning I called in a personal day at the plant, told them I had family business, which wasn't a lie, not in the way that mattered, and I drove straight to the county courthouse, the kind of squat beige building that always smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, where clerks shuffled behind glass windows like overworked bees. I asked for property records, wills, any public filings connected to the Mercer house, and the woman behind the counter gave me that polite but tired look, slid a stack of forms my way, and told me to wait. Sitting there in the hard plastic chair, I watched people around me, couples filing for divorce, old men arguing about zoning, young women clutching custody petitions, and I realized betrayal wasn't some unique curse on me. It was practically woven into the American fabric, the way ambition and selfishness tear at families like moths at old cloth. After an hour, they brought out copies of the latest filings, and my heart thumped when I saw Ryan's name scribbled in the margins of a preliminary draft. Not finalized yet, but close enough. Evidence that he'd been working behind my back with Mom and Dad, maybe even a lawyer, to tilt the scales. My hands shook slightly as I folded the papers into my jacket, not from fear, but from that rush of knowing your suspicions are real, that you aren't paranoid, and in that moment, I muttered under my breath, "Paper never lies," a line that felt so bitterly true, I almost laughed. On the way out, I ran into Mrs. Callahan, our old neighbor from across the street, a woman in her 70s who still remembered us as kids, and she smiled warmly, sighed, "Oh, Daniel, I always thought you'd be the one keeping that house up. You were the responsible one." And her words landed like a knife disguised as comfort, because they echoed the truth I knew but the family refused to admit. I nodded, forced a smile, told her I was doing fine, but as I walked away, I promised myself she'd live to see that instinct proven right. Back home, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, lined them up beside the receipts and loan papers I'd dug out of Dad's storage unit, and the puzzle started to form. A trail of negligence and deceit so clear that once exposed, Ryan's golden child mask would shatter like glass. The trick, though, wasn't just having the pieces, it was knowing when to play them, because one wrong move and he'd paint me as the bitter brother trying to ruin him. And Mom would believe it, Dad would stay silent, and the rest of the family would shrug. Timing was everything. That night, Ryan called again, his voice loud with beer and arrogance, and he said, "Mom's talking about a big family dinner next week. Maybe that'll be the time we make things official." And I clenched my teeth so hard my jaw ached, but I kept my tone light, looking forward to it, because what he didn't know was that official dinners cut both ways. After we hung up, I poured myself a whiskey, the cheap kind that burns but steadies you, and I stared at the baseball glove keychain dangling on the counter where I'd set my keys, and I thought about how Dad had said once, "A glove's only useful if you're ready for the pitch," and maybe that was the lesson hidden in the trinket, that patience without readiness is just waiting to be struck out. The week crept by, work draining me, each night spent poring over documents, marking notes in the margins, my notebook filling with phrases like "expose at the table" and "need undeniable proof" and "keep them guessing." Coworkers noticed I was quieter than usual. One of them joked I was planning a murder, and I laughed it off, but inside I thought not murder something worse, a slow unmasking that would leave him alive but ruined. Friday night I drove past the Mercer house, the porch light glowing warm, silhouettes moving in the living room, and I parked a block away, watching like a stranger. Through the window, I could see Ryan sprawled on the couch, Mom laughing at something he'd said. Dad's head tilted back in his chair, and the sight burned into me like acid me on the outside, him on the inside. The roles reversed from childhood when I was the one bringing groceries through the door while he was off charming some new crowd. I drove away before anyone spotted me, hands gripping the wheels so tight they cramped, and I muttered to myself, "Inside doesn't always mean you belong." Words I didn't fully understand yet but knew would matter later. Saturday, I met with a lawyer friend of mine from high school, a guy named Mark who owed me a favor after I once lent him money to cover rent during college. And I showed him some of the documents, asked him what they meant in practical terms. He leaned back, whistled low, and said, "Dan, if what you're showing me is accurate, your brother's skating on fraud, and your parents might not even realize it. Depending on how you use this, he could be locked out completely." My pulse quickened, but I forced calm, asked him not to say anything, not to even hint, and he nodded, told me I was holding a nuke in my hands. That night, I couldn't sleep again, so I drove to a 24-hour diner, the kind with flickering neon and endless refills of bad coffee, and I sat there alone in a booth, the smell of bacon grease clinging to the air, pens scratching across napkins as I drew out flowcharts of possible outcomes. Reveal too soon, lose leverage. Reveal too late, risk final papers signed. Reveal at dinner, maximum impact. A waitress with tired eyes asked if I was working on the next great American novel, and I chuckled, said, "Something like that," but inside I thought, no, I'm writing the obituary of my brother's illusions. By Sunday morning, I'd made my decision. The family dinner would be the stage, the documents my script, and Ryan the actor who didn't know the play was written to destroy him. I stood in my kitchen, mug of coffee warming my hands, staring at the baseball glove keychain resting by the sink, and I thought symbols only matter if you finish the story they represent, and this one wasn't finished yet. As the clock ticked forward and the week loomed, I felt the fire sharpen into ice again, and I knew the next move had to be precise, because one slip and everything would collapse like a house of cards in the wind, and I wasn't about to gamble years of sacrifice on a shaky hand. So I doubled down, spent the next few nights fine-tuning every detail, every piece of evidence, every phrase I might use if the moment came, rehearsing it in my head like a man practicing a testimony before God himself. At work, I was a ghost running machines, signing forms, but my mind was elsewhere, sketching out strategies in the oil-stained margins of shipping logs, piecing together the story so that when I finally told it, it wouldn't sound like bitterness or jealousy, but like the truth carved straight from stone. Each time Ryan called that week, his voice was buoyant, careless, dripping with smug anticipation, as if he was already crowned king of the Mercer household. And he made little slips, 2 jokes about how he'd finally have a place to bring people over, or how the upstairs could use a pool table. He spoke of our parents' house, not as a legacy, but as a prize he was already redecorating in his head, and every time he said it, I felt a flicker of rage that I had to smother, because rage makes you sloppy, and I couldn't afford sloppy. Meanwhile, I began leaving small seeds in conversations with extended family, an aunt over the phone, a cousin in passing, just quiet remarks like, "Yeah, Ryan's been spending a lot of time with Mom and Dad lately. I wonder what that's about," said casually, innocently, but calculated to build curiosity. By the time dinner rolled around, whispers would already be stirring, and curiosity is a powder keg, if you know how to light it. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in, when I'd stare at the ceiling in the dark and wonder if I was becoming the very thing I despised, manipulative, secretive, playing chess with people's lives. But then I'd picture Ryan smirking across the table, sliding his name across that deed, erasing me like chalk off a board, and the doubt turned back to resolve. On Thursday night, I drove to the Mercer house unannounced, under the pretense of dropping off some old tools Dad had once lent me, and I lingered longer than I needed to, walking through the rooms that smelled of childhood and memory, tracing the grain of the wooden banister I once slid down as a boy. Mom fussed over Ryan like he was still her little hero, heating up leftovers for him, laughing too loud at his half-funny stories, while Dad sat quietly in his recliner, nodding but not engaging, And I realized then that Dad knew something. He always did, but his silence was its own kind of surrender. As I left, Mom hugged me absently, her eyes already darting back to Ryan, and I clenched the steering wheel in the driveway, whispering, "Not yet, not yet." Friday came and went in a blur, and when Saturday finally arrived, the air felt heavy with inevitability, as though the whole town knew what was coming. I spent the morning ironing a shirt I rarely wore, polishing my boots, shaving carefully, not for vanity but for armor, because appearances mattered, because if I walked into that house looking haggard or desperate, my words would be colored with the same shade. I wanted to look steady, composed, undeniable. I tucked the folder of documents into a leather satchel, the weight of it reassuring against my side, and when I zipped it shut, it was like locking in a weapon. On the drive over, the radio played some old country ballad about betrayal and bloodlines. The kind of song you've heard 100 times, but on that night it felt personal, prophetic, and I turned it off just to keep my pulse steady. Pulling up to the house, I saw the driveway crowded with cars, siblings, cousins, maybe even neighbors, and the windows glowed warm in the dusk, laughter spilling faintly through the glass, and for a moment I almost faltered. It would have been so easy to park, walk inside, sit quietly, let the night pass, and pretend none of it mattered. But then I pictured Mrs. Callahan's words, "You were always the responsible one." And I thought, what is responsibility if not defending the truth? So I grabbed the satchel, straightened my shoulders, and walked up the path, every step heavy but certain, like a soldier marching into a war only he understood. The door opened before I could knock. Ryan standing there, wine glass in hand, that grin plastered across his face as if the whole evening were a play and he'd already claimed the lead role. "Danny boy," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "thought you might chicken out." I just smiled thinly, replied, "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" and stepped past him into the living room, where the air was thick with roasted chicken, laughter, and the hum of small talk. Mom bustled over, fussed with my collar like I was still her little boy, then drifted back to Ryan as if drawn by gravity, and Dad raised his glass slightly from across the room, a silent nod that I returned with equal quiet. I found my seat at the long wooden table, the same one we'd carved pumpkins on as kids, the same one we'd once gathered around for birthdays and Christmases, and as plates were passed and conversations rose, I sat there with my satchel resting at my feet, waiting, listening, every nerve coiled. Ryan dominated the talk, bragging about small victories at work, exaggerated stories of his network, dropping hints about future plans. And I noticed the way Mom encouraged him, the way cousins laughed too hard, the way Dad chewed silently. And I thought, this is exactly the stage I needed. At one point, Ryan leaned back, glass raised, and said loudly, "Well, since we're all here, maybe it's time we talk about what's next for the family house." And my heart kicked against my ribs, because this was it. The curtain rising, the moment where everything I'd built would either strike like lightning or crumble into ash. Every fork paused midair. Every cousin's chatter dying down like someone had turned the volume knob of the room to zero. And I could feel the weight of a dozen eyes land on Ryan, who smirked like a politician caught rehearsing a campaign speech, and still thinking he could charm his way through it. "What's next?" he said, swirling the wine, "is about fairness. About finally recognizing who's been here for Mom and Dad, who's really carried the Mercer name on his back, not just in money, but in presence, in love, in loyalty." He dragged the words like a net across the table, scooping up sympathy, and Mom nodded vigorously, her hand reaching for his wrist, like she was confirming the sermon of a preacher. "Ryan's right," she chimed, her voice bright, rehearsed. "He's been here every day these past years, helping me with groceries, fixing things around the house, keeping us company." My jaw tightened, because I knew the truth. Ryan hadn't fixed a thing unless you counted breaking locks on my patience, and most of his time, keeping company was just him lounging on their couch, sipping free beer and borrowing Dad's truck. Still, the cousins murmured, leaning in, the narrative working its spell, and Dad said nothing, only stared at his plate like it held answers he couldn't bear to read. I let the silence stretch, let Ryan think the room was his, and then I leaned forward slowly, deliberately, and said, "If we're going to talk about fairness, then let's talk about facts." The words cut through the air sharper than the carving knife in front of Dad, and a few relatives shifted in their seats, sensing a shift in temperature. Ryan scoffed, "Facts? Don't start with numbers, Danny boy. Life's not about numbers, it's about heart. and he tapped his chest like a stage actor, but I reached down, unzipped the satchel, and laid the folder flat on the table with a weighty thud that made even the silverware rattle. "These," I said, sliding out the first sheet, "are the mortgage payments I've been covering for the last 15 years, every month, without fail. When the factory was slow, when Dad's back went out, when Mom needed surgery, I paid. Not loans, not gifts. Payments. In full." Gasps rippled quietly, a cousin whispering something under her breath, an uncle craning his neck to read the page. Mom waved her hand dismissively. "Daniel, we don't need to drag receipts to the dinner table, this isn't—" But I didn't stop. I pulled out the next document, a stack of bank transfers, bills, dated checks. "This is the utility account, see whose name is on it?" "Mine. Every light that stayed on in this house, every warm shower, every hot meal you've been thanking Ryan while cashing my checks." Dad's fork clinked against his plate, his shoulders stiff, his lips pressed tight like stone. Ryan's smirk faltered, only for a heartbeat, then returned, thinner, more brittle. "So what, you want a medal?" He sneered, lifting his chin, but his voice lacked the bravado of a minute ago. I ignored him and pulled out the last set, the one that mattered most. "And here," I said, laying down the medical bills, "is the surgery Mom couldn't afford. The one the insurance didn't cover. I paid that too. Every cent. Because family comes first." My throat burned as I spoke it because I hadn't planned to say it out loud, hadn't planned to use Mom's vulnerability as evidence. But the lies Ryan spun left me no choice. The table was dead silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Eyes darted from me to Ryan, to the papers spread like weapons between us. Ryan laughed, too loud, a jagged sound. "Oh, so now you're the savior? You think money buys love? You think just because you wrote some checks, you're suddenly the golden child?" He slammed his glass down, wine splashing across the tablecloth like spilled blood. Mom reached to steady him, her voice sharp now. "Ryan, don't let him bait you, he's always been jealous. You know that, always competing, always trying to prove he's better. And that was the breaking point." I turned to her, calm but firm, my voice low enough to cut. "Jealous? Mom, I didn't want the glory. I wanted the family. I wanted us to stand on solid ground, not favors, not lies. You call him loyal because he sits on your couch, but loyalty isn't measured in presence. It's measured in sacrifice." She blinked, caught, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but had no words. Ryan, red-faced now, spat back. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Always the hero, always the saint. Well, guess what? Mom and Dad already promised me this house, and no stack of papers is going to change that." The room erupted, cousins murmuring, an aunt gasping, one uncle muttering, "Lord have mercy." Dad finally looked up, eyes dark and weary, and though he said nothing, the silence itself was a verdict. I leaned back, folded my hands, let the storm swirl around me because my case was made. The truth wasn't just on the table, it was the table now. The only thing anyone could see. Ryan puffed his chest, shouting about promises and love. Mom defending him with shaky words, but the cousins weren't nodding anymore. They were staring, eyes wide, minds turning. The myth of Ryan, the dutiful son, had cracked, and cracks spread fast in a family. I caught Dad's gaze across the chaos, and for the first time in years, he didn't look away. He gave the faintest nod, a gesture so small it might have been missed, but I saw it, and it told me the tide had shifted. Ryan slammed his fist down again, shouting my name like a curse, and Mom hissed at him to calm down, her voice fraying at the edges, but no one could calm him now, not with his empire collapsing in real time. My heart pounded, but I stayed still, silent. The satchel at my side now empty, but my hands steadier than they'd ever been. The war had begun, and for once, Ryan wasn't holding the sword, he was standing in the middle of the battlefield, barehanded, with everyone watching the armor peel off him piece by piece. And as I sat there, letting the room unravel, I realized that the real victory wasn't in shouting louder or striking harder, it was in letting the truth do the bleeding, because the truth, once freed, never goes back in the cage, and that's when the shouting turned raw, no longer performative, no longer a smug act but pure panic leaking from every syllable Ryan threw at me. His face flushed crimson, his eyes wild, his voice cracking under the strain as he jabbed a finger across the table. "You think this means anything?" He barked, practically spitting. "You think waving around some papers makes you the hero? This is my family, my house, my parents. You can't just buy your way into being the favorite. The words landed clumsy, desperate, like a man clinging to a rope that was already unraveling strand by strand. The cousins shifted, uneasy, and one of them muttered under her breath, "Doesn't look like buying, looks like saving," which sent Ryan snapping his head around, eyes darting like he'd just been betrayed by the very audience he thought he owned. Mom slammed her palm down on the table, startling everyone, her voice high and trembling. "Enough! Ryan has been here for us, Daniel. Don't you dare pretend money replaces love. He's the one who sat with me when I was lonely, who drove me to church when Dad couldn't, who—" But her words trailed off as she realized the eyes around the table weren't nodding, weren't buying the script anymore. They were questioning, dissecting, remembering all the times Ryan hadn't shown up when it truly mattered. Dad finally lifted his head, his voice gravelly but steady, like a door creaking open after years of rust. "Margaret," he said, addressing Mom but not looking at her, "don't rewrite history in front of everyone. We both know who's been keeping this house standing." The room froze, because Dad rarely contradicted her, never in public, and the silence that followed was louder than Ryan's shouting had ever been. Ryan whipped around toward him, betrayal plastered across his face. "You too? After everything? You're siding with him?" His voice cracked like a teenager's, shrill and jagged. Dad didn't answer immediately. He just sighed, ran a hand down his face, and finally muttered, "I'm siding with the truth." That was it, 5 words, and Ryan lost what little grip he had left. He shoved back his chair so hard it nearly toppled, the legs screeching against the hardwood, and stormed around the table, stabbing his finger toward me like he meant to gouge a hole in my chest. "You think you've won?" he shouted, his breath hot, his face so close I could smell the sour tang of the wine on him. "You'll regret this, Danny boy. You'll regret humiliating me in front of everyone, making me look like a leech." His hands trembled, not with strength but with fear, because he knew he wasn't in control anymore. Mom stood, clutching his arm, pleading, "Ryan, please don't do this here, not in front of them." But her voice was cracking too, desperation finally showing through her rehearsed loyalty. I stayed seated, calm, steady, my hands folded, my voice low and even, because I knew the more measured I was, the more his rage looked like guilt. "I didn't make you look like anything," I said. "You did that all by yourself." The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they landed like stones, and the cousins gasped, some even nodding subtly, because everyone knew it was true. Ryan roared, an animal sound, his fists clenching like he wanted to swing, but Dad rose then, slow but imposing, his hand firm, as he gripped Ryan's shoulder and pushed him back a step. "Sit down," he commanded, and for the first time in years, Ryan obeyed not because he wanted to, but because even he couldn't break the iron in Dad's tone. He slumped back into his chair, seething, his chest heaving, his eyes bloodshot and darting, while Mom hovered over him, stroking his back like he was a wounded child instead of a grown man exposed in front of his family. The table stayed hushed, the air thick, the cousins and uncles and aunts watching the drama like it was both horrifying and inevitable, like they were seeing in real time the fracture lines that had always been there but never spoken aloud. I leaned back, let the silence stretch, let the evidence on the table speak louder than I ever could. Finally, Dad sat too, his fork abandoned, his shoulders sagging, and he muttered just loud enough for the table to hear, "I should have stopped this years ago." Mom flinched, her eyes wide, her mouth opening to argue but closing again when she saw no one at the table was with her, not anymore. Ryan buried his face in his hands, groaning, rocking slightly, and in that moment he didn't look like the golden child anymore. He looked like a man stripped of his costume, bare and small, a boy who had relied too long on someone else's applause. The cousins began whispering, words like, "didn't know," and "all those years" floating in the air, and the spell Ryan had woven his whole life was gone, snapped like a cheap thread. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice, didn't deliver a victory speech. I just sat calm and still, because I knew what came next wasn't about the dinner. It was about the fallout, the slow unraveling of a family that had chosen its golden child, and now had to reckon with the truth that their hero had been propped up on my shoulders all along. And as I watched Ryan squirm in the wreckage of his myth, I felt a cold clarity settle in. I didn't need to punish him tonight. The truth had already begun its work, and the real revenge was in letting him live with the silence, the stares, the shame that no amount of charm or excuses could ever patch back together. The days after that dinner felt like the air had shifted permanently, like every phone call and text carried a different weight, a different silence. And the first ripple came less than 24 hours later when Mom called. Her voice bright but brittle, dripping with that forced cheer she used whenever she was covering panic. "Daniel, honey," she started, "you embarrassed your brother in front of everyone. You know how sensitive he is. You should have come to us privately instead of airing dirty laundry. Family business is family business." I let her talk, let her spin, let her weave excuses around Ryan like a blanket too thin to keep out the draft. And when she'd paused for breath, I only said, "I didn't embarrass him, Mom. He did that himself." There was a long pause, the kind where I could almost hear her biting her lip, and then the click of her hanging up without saying goodbye. That was how it went. Mom circling the wagons, calling cousins, insisting Ryan was just under pressure and that I was showing off. But the problem for her was that the truth had been put in writing, in hard numbers, and whispers spread faster than she could smother them. One cousin texted me, "Never knew it was that bad." "Respect, man," another sent. "Makes sense now why you never came to parties. Guess you were too busy holding them up." Meanwhile, Ryan tried his own version of damage control, calling family members late at night, his voice slurred from drinks, insisting I had manipulated the bank, forged papers, staged the whole thing. But the more he protested, the guiltier he sounded, and when one uncle asked bluntly, "So you didn't take the inheritance advance?" Ryan apparently hung up, which told them all they needed to know. Dad didn't call not once, but I got the sense he'd chosen silence over defense, and in that silence there was something like an admission that he'd seen everything, known everything, and simply been too tired or too complicit to stop it. I saw him once, at the grocery store, pushing a cart alone, looking smaller than I remembered, and when our eyes met he gave me the faintest nod, not warm, not apologetic, but heavy, like a man acknowledging a truth too late. Mom, on the other hand, doubled down. She left me voicemails about family loyalty, about how Ryan was fragile and how I should make amends, as if I had been the one caught siphoning money, as if truth itself was cruelty. I didn't answer, I didn't fight back. I just let the silence grow. That silence was its own weapon, sharper than yelling, colder than confrontation, because for once they had to sit in it without me filling the gaps, without me explaining or smoothing or carrying. And in that silence, I could feel the fracture spreading. The cousins started pulling back from Ryan, the invitations to barbecues and birthdays dried up, the aunts whispered less about me being aloof and more about Ryan being reckless. The mythology of the golden child was rotting, collapsing under the weight of real numbers and real consequences, and every time Ryan tried to claw it back with excuses, he only dug the hole deeper. I heard through the grapevine that he'd had a meltdown at Mom's, shouting that no one respected him anymore, that I had ruined his life, and Mom had cried begging him to be strong, but Dad apparently just walked out of the room, leaving them both in the wreckage. And me? I stayed quiet. I went to work, I paid my bills, I lived my life with a calm they couldn't touch. Friends would ask if I felt vindicated, if I felt good finally being seen for the one who'd carried everything. But it wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was something colder, steadier, like watching a storm I'd predicted finally break. I didn't have to raise my voice or twist the knife. All I had to do was step back, and let the truth do what it always does when it's finally dragged into the light. Burn through every lie until nothing is left but the ash. Ryan's spiral didn't happen in one dramatic collapse. It was slower, jagged, the kind of descent you only noticed when you compared where he was now to who he used to be. And in those weeks after the dinner, I heard about it in fragments. Little stories leaking from different corners of the family, each one a piece of a puzzle that painted a picture of a man thrashing to hold on to an image already slipping away. One cousin told me Ryan had shown up at his house at midnight, reeking of whiskey, ranting about how I'd framed him and how the whole family was turning against him, pacing the living room like a caged animal until he finally passed out on the couch. Another cousin said Ryan had started asking for loans. Not large sums, just a few hundred here, a few hundred there, but the fact that he was asking at all shocked them, because for years he'd been the one Mom paraded around as the successful son, the golden boy, the one with potential. And now here he was, hat in hand, trying to scrape together cash from the very relatives who used to look up to him. Mom defended him at every turn. Of course, she told anyone who would listen that Ryan was just going through a rough patch, that I had sabotaged him by airing things publicly, And I think part of her believed it, because the alternative that her favorite son had been bleeding me dry for years while she looked away was too much for her to bear. She called me one night, voice sharp, demanding I fix this. And when I asked her what exactly I was supposed to fix, she snapped, "Your brother's reputation! Do you want him to be a laughingstock?" I sat there in silence, and when I didn't answer, she broke down crying, whispering that she couldn't stand the thought of people looking at Ryan differently. I didn't comfort her. Not anymore. Dad stayed quiet through it all, which was its own kind of indictment. He didn't defend Ryan, didn't defend me, just retreated into silence, like he'd chosen to finally step off the stage of a play that had gone on too long. Meanwhile, Ryan flailed harder. He showed up at a family barbecue uninvited, swaggering like nothing had happened. But when people gave him polite smiles instead of admiration, he grew louder, more abrasive, telling old stories where he was the hero, trying too hard to laugh, until finally one uncle muttered under his breath, "He's pathetic," loud enough for me to hear later through the grapevine. That was the beginning of the shift, the golden aura cracking, the whispers turning from awe to pity. And Ryan couldn't stand pity. I heard he called Mom one night in tears, saying he was done, that no one respected him, that he was better off gone, and Mom panicked, rushing to his apartment, staying there for 2 days straight, trying to hold him together while he lay in bed, curtains drawn, sulking like a child denied his toy. But then, as always, she turned it back on me, leaving me voicemail saying I needed to apologize before Ryan did something drastic. I didn't call back, because I had finally learned the hardest truth. Every time I tried to save Ryan, I only gave him more rope to hang me with, and if he was going to spiral, then he was going to spiral without me cushioning the fall. And so I stayed silent, I stayed steady, I stayed outside the storm. Friends asked if I worried he might actually hurt himself, and I'll admit the thought crossed my mind, but deep down I knew Ryan too well. His threats weren't about ending his life, they were about keeping everyone chained to him through fear and guilt. That had always been his weapon. And Mom, bless her blind heart, fell for it every time, hovering over him like he was still 12 years old, while Dad disappeared deeper into his own shadows. What Ryan didn't realize, or maybe refused to admit, was that the family wasn't circling him anymore. They were peeling away, quietly, politely, choosing distance over drama. And I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was let the silence expand. The golden child had become a ghost, and the more he tried to shout himself back into relevance, the more invisible he became. The breaking point came not with some quiet surrender, but with one last wild swing, because Ryan had always been a gambler at heart, and when gamblers see the chips slipping away, they don't fold, they double down, even when the table's empty and no one's watching, and that's exactly what he did one evening in late summer when I got a text from Mom, frantic and jumbled, saying Ryan was in trouble, that he'd done something stupid, and I should get over here now, before it was too late. I didn't rush. I read it twice, then set the phone down, because I had learned that urgency was his favorite leash, and I wasn't going to let him yank it anymore. An hour later, my cousin called, voice low, telling me Ryan had shown up at Mom's house, screaming that he deserved his share, that since I wasn't supporting the family anymore, he was entitled to the savings Mom and Dad had tucked away for emergencies, demanding the passbook, demanding the keys, pounding on the kitchen table so hard the salt shaker split open and scattered like glass. Mom cried, begged, tried to calm him, but he wouldn't stop, and when Dad finally told him to get out before I called the police, Ryan laughed in his face, said he wasn't scared of Dad, wasn't scared of me, wasn't scared of anyone, because he was the one who had always been chosen, the one people would remember, not me. That was his last card, the mythology he'd been raised on, the belief that he was untouchable. But the thing about myths is that once they're exposed, they unravel fast, and by then most of the family had already stopped buying his version of the story. Mom still clung to it, though clung to him, called me again and again that night, leaving voicemails through tears. Daniel, please, he's your brother. He just needs help. He's not himself. Don't let him do something he'll regret. I listened to each one, alone in my kitchen, and for a moment I felt the old pull, the urge to be the fixer, the bridge, the one who carried both their weight and mine. But then I remembered every check, every late-night call, every time I was painted as cold while he was painted as golden, every way they had let him drain me while they applauded his smile, and I sat in that memory until the guilt curdled into clarity. I didn't drive over. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't intervene when Ryan stormed out of their house that night and peeled his tires down the street like a teenager throwing a tantrum. Because the truth was, there was nothing left to save, not his image, not his control, not even the bond between us. A week later, I heard he'd tried one last ploy, cornered a few relatives at a birthday party, spinning a story about how I'd stolen from him, how I was the selfish one who'd cut him off while hoarding everything for myself. But instead of nodding along like they once did, people pushed back, politely but firmly, asking him for proof, asking why he never worked, asking why he kept showing up empty-handed but full of demands. And when he couldn't answer, when his voice cracked and his excuses tangled on themselves, he lashed out, called everyone traitors, stormed out again. And that, I think, was the moment even Mom couldn't deny anymore. The moment she saw the world wasn't conspiring against her son, it was just tired of him. She called me one last time, her voice small, asking me to be the bigger person and extend a hand. I told her, calmly, without anger, without cruelty, that I already had for years, with money, with patience, with silence, and that I was done. For once, she didn't argue. She just cried softly, like she was mourning not Ryan but the story she had built around him. Ryan didn't fade overnight, but the family stopped centering him, stopped protecting him, stopped feeding the fire. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to carry the weight of his fall. I simply watched it happen. The silence that followed Ryan's unraveling was louder than any shouting match we'd ever had, because for the first time in our lives there was no chase, no scramble to smooth things over, no late-night phone calls dragging me back into the storm, only a long, echoing quiet that spread through the family like fog, heavy and undeniable. And I realized quickly that this was my first taste of revenge, not in the form of a fiery confrontation or a dramatic exile, but in the quiet way his absence exposed everything, how the void he left wasn't filled with longing but with relief. People stopped asking where he was, stopped waiting for him to show up late and loud, stopped excusing the chaos he brought. And the gatherings that had once revolved around him now unfolded with an ease I'd almost forgotten was possible. Dinners that weren't interrupted by his demands, conversations that weren't bent around his moods, laughter that didn't feel nervous or forced. And in that stillness, I started to feel the weight of years lift from my shoulders, not because I had cut him down directly, but because I had refused to play my old part, and without me there to steady the stage, his act collapsed on its own. Mom struggled the hardest, her eyes scanning every doorway at family events, her sentences trailing off into half-formed hopes, and though she never said it outright, I knew she was waiting for me to break, to cave, to be the one to rebuild what had been shattered. But I didn't. I held my ground. I answered her questions with polite brevity, never cruel, never sharp, just calm, detached, steady. And over time, I saw the shift, saw the way even she stopped expecting him, the way her tone softened when she spoke to me, almost as if she realized the son she had once treated as secondary was the only one still standing steady in her life. It wasn't victory in the cinematic sense. No applause, no grand reckoning. It was colder, subtler, and far more lasting. Ryan was no longer the center. He was an afterthought, a cautionary whisper, a name people didn't bring up unless they had to. And for a man who had lived off attention, off being chosen, off being defended no matter the cost, that silence was sharper than any blade I could have drawn myself. Revenge didn't come with fire. It came with quiet, with distance, with the slow erosion of the pedestal he'd been handed all his life. And standing in that quiet, I realized I didn't need to destroy him. He was doing that just fine on his own. All I had to do was stop helping. It didn't take long before Ryan tried to crawl back, because men like him never accept silence as the final word. They mistake it for a pause, an opening, a chance to rehearse a new version of their old script, and sure enough, one Sunday morning he showed up at my door. Unshaven, jittery, smelling faintly of stale smoke and desperation, his voice already pitched in that pleading register he used when he wanted something, saying he was ready to turn things around, that he just needed a little help to get started, that this time would be different if only I'd spot him some cash to cover rent, maybe help with a used car, maybe even put in a word at my company since I owed him at least that much after everything. And for a moment I just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, watching him try to spin threads out of thin air, his eyes darting between mine, looking for the old Daniel, the fixer, the brother who would melt at the sight of him in pieces. But that Daniel was gone. I let him finish his pitch, every excuse, every promise, and when he was done, I simply said, calm and level, no. Not cruel, not angry, just final. He blinked, like he hadn't heard me right, then tried again. Faster this time, words tumbling over each other, mixing guilt with flattery, reminding me of childhood moments as if nostalgia could unlock my wallet. Again I said, no. And the silence that followed was so much heavier than the one between us before, because now it wasn't just absence, it was rejection, direct and undeniable, a door closing that he couldn't pry open. He tried to laugh it off, tried to call me cold, selfish, said I was abandoning family, that Mom would never forgive me if I let him sink. But even that had lost its power. I didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't justify. I just repeated it, slower this time. No, Ryan, I'm done. And for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to place the blame, no scapegoat to lean on. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw twitching, eyes wet with something between rage and disbelief, then finally spat out, "You'll regret this," before storming off down the sidewalk, shoulders hunched, shrinking with every step. But I didn't regret it. Not that night, not the next day, not even weeks later when Mom called, voice thick with worry, telling me Ryan was struggling, asking if I could at least check on him just to make sure he's okay. I told her gently that I hoped he figured it out, but that it wasn't my job anymore. She didn't argue. For once, she seemed to understand that I wasn't being cruel, I was being free. And in the months that followed, as Ryan bounced between couches and half-hearted jobs, as his stories wore thinner and his calls grew fewer, the family stopped waiting for him to get it together. They started inviting me over more, started asking my opinion, started leaning toward me in ways they never had before, quietly acknowledging with their actions what they couldn't bring themselves to say aloud, that the brother they'd once dismissed as responsible but dull was the one who had built something lasting, something steady, something they could actually rely on. And that shift, subtle, unspoken, undeniable, was the sweetest revenge of all, because Ryan could feel it too. He could see it every time he walked into a room, and the attention that once fell on him drifted past, landing on me instead, not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it, and that was a stage he could never steal back. The final humiliation came not with some explosive fight, not with cops at the door or fists on the table, but with something quieter, sharper, and far more permanent. The moment the family stopped seeing him as the center and started seeing him for what he really was, and it happened during one of those rare occasions when everyone gathered a birthday dinner for Mom that Ryan, against all odds, actually showed up to, late as usual, disheveled and jittery, trying to play his old part, cracking jokes too loud, dragging the spotlight toward himself as if nothing had changed. But this time, no one bit. The laughter was thin, polite, and then it shifted away, conversations sliding past him like water around a rock, and for the first time I watched him realize, really realize, that he wasn't the favored son anymore, that the gravity he'd always counted on had collapsed. He tried harder, leaning in, interrupting, telling stories that once would have drawn gasps and smiles, but instead they drew blank stares, awkward glances, forks clinking against plates as people quietly returned to their own conversations. And when Mom finally stood to cut the cake, she did something I'll never forget. She handed me the first slice. It wasn't a grand gesture, not intentional maybe, but the look on Ryan's face, the way his mouth went tight, his eyes dropped, his shoulders sagged, told me he felt the weight of it like a blade. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chosen. He wasn't defended. He wasn't the one the room orbited around. And in that moment, I didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say a word. I just accepted the plate, thanked Mom, and carried on, steady and calm. That was the justice, his own undoing, his own irrelevance, not because I had shouted him down or dragged him through the mud, but because I had stepped away, and without me there to prop him up, the illusion collapsed. Later that night, as people drifted out, Ryan cornered me in the driveway, his voice low, bitter, accusing me of turning everyone against him, of poisoning Mom, of stealing the life that should have been his. And I looked at him, this man who had once been the golden child, now trembling with rage and defeat, and I said simply, "No, Ryan, you did that yourself." I got in my car and drove away, leaving him standing there under the streetlight, small and hollow, and I felt no triumph in the loud, vengeful sense, just a deep, quiet satisfaction that the scales had finally balanced, that for once the truth didn't need me to argue for it, that justice had unfolded not with fire but with silence, with absence, with the simple power of refusing to carry someone else's chaos. And that, I realized, was the coldest revenge of all. Not destroying him, but letting him destroy himself while I walked away whole. Even after the papers were signed and the house was legally mine, I didn't rush to change anything. I let the dust settle in silence because part of me wanted to see if Ryan would come crawling back one more time. Maybe with an apology, maybe with some excuse about stress or bad judgment, but he didn't, not even when the locks changed and the lawyers made it official. He just disappeared into the kind of silence that tells you a person would rather drown in their pride than admit they were wrong, and strangely, I respected that more than any hollow apology he might have offered, because at least he stayed consistent, even if that consistency was nothing but cowardice in a nice suit. And yet when I stood alone in the living room one night with only the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the floorboards, I realized something that almost made me laugh out loud. The house, the land, the inheritance, it had never really been about money or even family honor. It was about proof. Proof that I hadn't been the fool they painted me as. Proof that years of sacrifice and long nights in the office and early mornings pounding coffee like fuel hadn't been for nothing. And now that proof sat in my name, black ink on white paper, sealed and untouchable. But instead of triumph, I felt this strange hollow stillness, like winning a game you never wanted to play in the first place. And I knew then that revenge doesn't give you peace, it just hands you the quiet knowledge that you stood your ground and didn't get buried, which is sometimes enough. I walked through the kitchen and ran my hand over the counter where Mom used to set down her pot of chili every Sunday, the smell of cumin and tomatoes and beef flooding my memory so sharp I almost swore I could taste it again. And I thought about how food was the only language my family ever really spoke fluently. Ryan got seconds without asking. I got stuck with dishes. Dad grumbled about salt. Mom smiled through it all, and maybe that's why I held on to chili as the symbol through this whole mess, because it wasn't just about dinner. It was about belonging, about who got served first and who was left scraping the bottom of the pot, and in the end I made sure Ryan was the one left scraping, that he understood in a language older than contracts or deeds, that he no longer had a seat at the table, and that was justice in its purest form. A few nights later, I invited some friends over. Nothing big, just a handful of guys I trusted. The kind who show up with 6-packs and don't ask too many questions, and I cooked chili, my version, heavy on spice, light on nostalgia. And as we ate in the same kitchen that once echoed with family fights, I felt a quiet kind of healing because laughter filled the air again. Not bitterness, not betrayal, just the simple sound of people who had my back without needing anything in return. And one of them raised his beer and said, "To new chapters." And I raised mine too, but in my head I finished the sentence. To surviving the old ones first. After they left and the house was quiet again, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, even though it was nearly midnight, the night air cool against my skin, the faint hum of crickets in the distance, and I realized that coffee had become my own anchor, my reset button, a small ritual that stayed the same, no matter how chaotic everything else got. And I thought maybe that was why I always trusted it more than people, because a cup of coffee never switches sides. It just gives you exactly what you pour into it, nothing more, nothing less. Looking back now, I've got no illusions. I know scars don't vanish just because you win on paper, and I know betrayal leaves you second-guessing smiles and favors for years afterward, but I've learned something I wish I knew 10 years earlier. Loyalty isn't proven by blood or last names. It's proven by consistency, by who shows up when you're at your worst, and doesn't use it against you later. And if I had to carve that into stone for the next generation of stubborn men who think sacrifice guarantees love, I'd put it like this: don't confuse duty with devotion, because one can be demanded, but the other can only be earned. The inheritance, the house, even Ryan's downfall, all of it will fade into the background of my life eventually, like old news clippings shoved in a drawer. But the lesson stays sharp, and if anyone ever asks me what I gained from all of this, besides square footage and a deed with my name on it, I'll tell them, I gained a kind of freedom you can't put a price tag on. The freedom of no longer chasing the approval of people who were only ever going to see me as useful, until I stopped paying their bills. And once that dawns on you, once you stop auditioning for love that isn't coming, you can finally start living on your own terms. I don't know where Ryan is now, maybe some rented apartment, maybe still spinning stories about how he was cheated, maybe drinking alone with the same smugness he always wore like a second skin. But I don't waste much thought on it anymore, because revenge already did its job. It handed me closure in the form of silence, and silence is sometimes the loudest victory you can get. And if there's one last piece of advice I'd leave anyone listening, it's this. Protect your peace like property. Defend it harder than your paycheck, because once someone takes it from you, winning it back costs more than any inheritance ever could. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.